We begin the day's program with a debate on the freedom to dissent. Please welcome on stage our speakers for this morning, scholar, translator, and editor of the Gauri Lankesh Reader, Chandan Gowda, human rights activist and author of the best-selling memoir, The Girl with Seven Names, Hyeonseo Lee, Sadaf Saaz, poet, writer, entrepreneur, and women's rights advocate from Bangladesh. T.M. Krishna, Carnatic musician, public intellectual, and winner of the Ramon Magsaysay Award 2016. And senior journalist, educationist, and human rights activist Teesta Setalvad, also one of the founders of the civil rights group Citizen for Justice and Peace. In conversation with them is N. Ravi, publisher of the Hindu group of newspapers and former editor-in-chief of the Hindu.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first session of the second day of the Hindu Lit for Life Festival. On the subject of freedom to dissent. Dissent is a deceptively simple word. In its mildest version of contrary opinion, every regime and every group would pay lip service to the democratic practice of allowing dissent. It becomes problematic, however, as it moves to its more extreme forms of challenging the legitimacy of the regime or its core narrative, or the mainstream accounts of any religious or caste or other groups, and extends even to mild criticism of religious, social, or regional icons. Often in these cases, dissent is being countered by the might of the state as well as the street power of organized mobs. The question before us is the space for dissent shrinking? Is the freedom to dissent now under pressure because the state itself is becoming increasingly intolerant? With an ideologically sympathetic party in office, are religious, caste, and regional groups now emboldened to take offense and use violence and the might of at the slightest expression of contrary opinion? Is the threat of state action or the threat of violence and even death, as in the case of Gauri Lankesh, are these forcing political opponents and creative sections such as artists and writers to mute their voices of dissent? Are we going to see more incidents of the kind that Salman Rushdie, M.F. Hussain, Wendy Doniger, and Taslima Nasreen have faced? Is the controversy over Padmavati just a straw in the wind? We have a whole slew of British-era laws that are being used to punish dissent. For instance, a very broad and general blasphemy law in Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code penalizes outraging religious feelings. Section 153A makes it an offense to foster enmity among different religious or social sections. Again, sedition law in Section 124A penalizes anyone exciting disaffection against the government established by law, while prohibiting hate speech and speech instigating violence is a legitimate object of the legal framework in a democracy. Are these laws overbroad and susceptible to misuse? Are even academic publishers being frightened by these laws to withdraw books at the slightest objection to its contents? How does one safeguard the freedom to dissent? In an interesting book referred to by Nicholas Kristof in his column, two American academics, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt of Harvard lay out some warning signs of an authoritarian leader. And that is, he shows only a weak commitment to democratic rules. He or she denies the legitimacy of opponents, tolerates violence, and shows some willingness to curb civil liberties and the media. They go on to conclude that Trump has demonstrated all four of these tendencies, but the American institutions are strong enough to protect freedoms. Are the Indian institutions robust enough to protect the freedom to dissent? Is another question that we have to address. These are just some of the issues that concern us regarding dissent. And to discuss the issue of dissent, we have a very distinguished and interesting panel here. Two of them, Teesta and Hyeonseo, have had deeply troubling and even traumatic personal experiences while taking on the state and expressing dissent. Teesta Setalvad, in a determined campaign to expose state complicity and bring to book those involved in communal killings, has faced the might of the state, obviously because of her dissent, though ostensibly for breaking other laws. Likewise, Hyeonseo has been forced to take refuge outside our country and is also a human rights activist. We have three panelists working in the area of culture: T.M. Krishna, outstanding Carnatic musician and also outspoken critic of some parts of tradition, who is a winner of the Magsaysay Award; Sadaf Saaz, poet, writer, women's rights advocate and cultural activist from Bangladesh, who has had experience of her friends being repressed and treated even worse in Bangladesh; and Chandan Gowda, who has written extensively on culture, is a cultural critic and is a professor at Azim Premji University. The three people here involved in culture have also had close associates such as Gauri Lankesh and Perumal Murugan come under pressure for expressing dissent. So, without further ado, let's move on to the program. And I would go by the order given in this program sheet and start with Chandan Gowda.
I think what the last few years have made clear, something that was always sort of clear for many, but this is of a greater clarity, that we all seem to be seeking a liberal, the protection of liberal values, with two crucial things missing. I mean, the state doesn't seem to be particularly committed to securing a liberal order, nor is there a great desire on the part of those the citizens the liberal values don't seem to appeal very much. And I don't mean to caricature a situation or overdraw the starkness of these things. But when someone says we'll change the constitution, there's a lot of angst amongst the well-meaning, educated intelligentsia. But you look around, most people couldn't care less about that particular claim being made. And you wonder what the last 65 years of education, where civics lessons were part of textbooks, I mean, what have they done really? At least even to those who went to the schools. And in a telegraphic way, something that Shiv Vishwanathan said has stayed in my mind. He says Indians have by-hearted democracy, and something like that seems to have happened, where there's a semblance of literacy about what it means, but there's no true, robust appreciation of what it is. And so, what's to be done in that case? Clearly, you need a collective repudiation of the state's, uninterest. I mean, if there's a culture of lies, people are being killed. There is silence, there's no regret, let alone an expression of assurance that one can continue to do your work and we'll be here to stand by you. That seems to be too much to expect. And the state itself seems to be complicit. When I say the state, I mean the ruling dispensation. And I must say things are not hopeless as far as the response is concerned. We have very many brave activists who repudiate some of these claims. There are individual heroes who, without much gain are trying to expose these things, and I'm thankful for them. But if building a civil society is something that we continue to want to do, how must we go about it is a question that is on my mind constantly. And we have a great tradition of civil liberties activists, of course, but there's also an exhaustion, I feel, with ideological reasoning and the sort of polarizations that seems to be structuring the discussion in public, be it religious, secular, or anything else, which are very strong. So how do we do it in a way that doesn't exclude tradition and the modern, faith and reason, art and science, and without asking for a happy complementarity either, or do we retain them both and look for something outside? I don't know, but this is something I suppose we'll all need to give thought to. Just to focus on one narrow aspect of a sort of a solution amongst many modes of solutions I suppose we need to look for. If all of us are worried about a certain reshaping of conscience, if we will, that's happening amidst us, if there's a certain, the name for it often used is fascism, fascism of both that's religious based as well as consumerist driven. How does one go about handling this? Will a certain rights-based activism help in addressing people at the level of, how do you rework your own self, as it were, to curb fascist instincts? And most of you in the room will know that, much of the Indian ethical, moral traditions have taken the question of the self very seriously and have even asked for setting aside of the ego as an essential, as something that's necessary for self-realization. So we have this tradition within us. It's a living tradition. It's not just a textual tradition one seeks out in the archives. How does one work with them is something that I've always felt very drawn to. And there are two quotes that your Anantamurthy used to remind us all the time from Purandaradasa. One quote is Uttama Prabhutva Lodalotte, which meant the noblest power is worthless, or even the noblest power is worthless. And there's something by Basavanna who would say that a dead rabbit is more useful than a king's corpse. You can at least eat the rabbit's meat. You can't do anything here. So this disregard, this complete confident indifference to the value of power is an important heritage. There's of course a fascination with power too alongside, but this is something we need to cherish and work with. It is too important to not take seriously for political activism. T.M. Krishna is working with tradition in interesting ways. The question of tradition and what that should mean for our activism will be an extremely important one. And I think the answers are not one or two. There'll be plural ways of working with tradition, including seeming traditional and not being traditional at all. You can simply be extremely creative in political terms, like Gandhi was. Again, something Anantamurthy said, Gandhi was not a traditionalist, he was creative. We seem to find resonances in the Bible here and there, but he was truly being creative in the present. So finding normative frames for some of the problems that we seem to constantly be troubled by. The Rohingyas come and someone says they should be sent out, and there's a very casual way in which it's being supported. Yes, let's send them back, including some of my students who have been chosen after a careful selection process for their seriousness about academics. So how can this sort of an abdication of seriousness, moral seriousness about life take root? And how does one go about addressing this is something I think we need to give urgent thought to. And I think and also when I talked about the saintly tradition, it's not just about the question of power and or just seeing it as illegitimate. It's also about the value of work and value of living simply and austerely, whose values also can't be underestimated. We are all worried about the freedom of expression under threat, but the freedom to consume is not under threat. But that is something that has to be under threat from other sources. This seems to be an extraordinary license to live extravagantly and irresponsibly. And again, you have a tradition that has constantly looked down upon those things, arrogance, and self-indulgence in material terms has been frowned upon, and that's the heritage of this thinking. Moral thinking is precious, very precious. So when we are thinking about dissent, forms of dissent, you have, of course, big macro paradigms of dissent, but I would alongside urge everyone to think of, small acts of personal dissent in creative ways and leave behind a rich creative legacy. Because again, another casualty of our times is a certain mode of celebrity-led activism, and people are quite happy to outsource the difficult task of thinking on how to act rightly. I think it's good that we have the right kind of activists and who have a large following, but I also feel it can induce a certain lethargy among the followers about how hard the work of political action is and how one must constantly think of doing something in one's own life in little ways, small ways, if not the grand ways that invite death these days.
Thank you, Chandan. The focus on personal action to strengthen dissent. In fact, I would like to draw your attention to the point made by Levitsky and Ziblatt in their book that more effective than attacking those who want to suppress dissent would be to stand firm in the defense of rights. That's an approach they would advocate to strengthen the freedom to dissent. That's a thought you might come back to later, maybe. I will now request Hyeonseo Lee, who has had experience in North Korea, perhaps the most difficult state in which one is able to speak out, to share her thoughts.
I came from the most ridiculous country in the world, North Korea. Because it's the country where there's no freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religious, just nothing. We don't even have a freedom words and human rights. Certainly we don't have a human rights words in North Korea. And then freedom words, we do have freedom, but we can't use that words for myself. We have to use that in the sentence with the dear leader. Under his embrace, we are so free, something like that. So growing up in the country, because we were so blocked from the outside world, and the regime just told us that the communism that we are living was a utopia, and then outside of North Korea, like other countries, it's all like disaster. People are dying there. They don't have enough money. That's why they are suffering, etc. And then America, how they're horrible that colonizing South Korea even today, because South Korea is all divided country. That's so important, the education for us, that people are. That they're executing South Korean people even until today. So we never learned democracy in North Korea or capitalism. None of it in the textbook or experience, because there was no comparison what it looked like, because we are not allowed to leave North Korea. We are not allowed to have passports, and we don't know what's the definition of visa. That's why we were just we were living in a virtual huge prison in a cave. So until I really escaped my country to China, I really believed North Korea is the best country in the world, and my dear leader is the greatest human being on this planet, because we have only one TV channel until today in North Korea, and then watching foreign media contents, it's illegal. And if there's a lot of South-Korean dramas and Hollywood movies these days are fled into North Korea through the border from China, and whoever watches secretly, if they were captured, some of them will be in public execution. As examples, it's just showing to people, if you see that same content, you will be exactly killed like the person, like you, or the victims. So we are not only loyal to the government with our heart, but at the same time with the fear, because we grew up with watching constant public executions, that people are dying in front of you, and the people are disappeared in the middle of the night, the whole family members. Like after one of family members made a mistake by saying wrong things, only political words, and then the whole family were removed in the middle of the night to the political prison camp, where over more than 100,000 people are continue to suffer and under forced labor, torture, and death until today. So I was so scared to not being sent to political prison camp or to not being executed. That's why we hear, what we see, we had to, swallow ourselves. We couldn't tell anyone, even between husband and wife in North Korea, they couldn't trust each other because we have a lot of spies and informants paid by the government. There's no true friend. So for example, my friend's father, my best friend's father, he told his best friend when they're having drinking together at night, he just said, very simple one. He said, "This system is unfair." He just said that, that's all. But his whole family, including my friend, they were disappeared in the middle of the night. So that's why we were super scared under the system. So that's the reason, until today, the North Korea is very stable actually. They're controlling people, and then the North Korean people become modern day slaves until right now. Yeah.
Thank you. That opens our eyes to a most troubling part of the world, and you have had to live through those experiences. We could come back to that during question time, maybe. I would like now to invite Sadaf Saaz from Bangladesh, who has had experience of our friends coming under pressure. She has been an activist and has been fighting for the rights of women especially. Could you tell us of the situation in Bangladesh with regard to freedom to dissent?
I think thank the organizers for this session, and just chatting a bit before the session that probably 7-8 years ago we wouldn't be having a session like this, and now I think that the question is kind of a bit rhetorical in the sense that are there spaces for dissent shrinking? Yes, and in Bangladesh we're facing that on various fronts. And while a lot of the things that I was hearing yesterday echoes a lot of what is happening in Bangladesh with regards to reduced freedom of expression from the side of clamping down by the government, and also kind of trolls on the internet, I think that everybody is aware of what has been happening in Bangladesh since 2013, where we have seen a huge increase in the threats and incidences of violence against bloggers, writers, publishers, creative personalities. So basically since 2013, over 46 writers, publishers, journalists have been hacked to death by Islamist extremists. And then last year, we had, not last year, 2016, in July, we had a serious attack, largely against foreigners who are non-Muslim, at one of our neighborhood cafes, Holy Bakery. And so, it's against this backdrop that, we've been trying to function. And what I would sort of say is that so basically what it does is, initially, I think in 2013, this spate of killings came out basically as a sort of response to the war crime trials. And if you kind of like take sort of a step back and you sort of see how we emerged as a nation in 1971, which was kind of coming out of the shadow of what happened in 1947, the dividing of nations based on religion. And we tried to emerge from that in 1971 by fighting for and standing up for our right to live in a secular, democratic state. But what I would say is kind of the long war from Bangladesh, there were some elements left over which we didn't deal with effectively. And so the Awami League government came in, in the elections before 2011, basically based on a mandate to bring to trial the war criminals. And what happened was in February 2013, there was a kind of spontaneous response to a fear that there was an underhand deal being brokered where some of the war criminals would be let off with leniency. And this was a spontaneous gathering, one of the main junctions in Dhaka at Shahbag, where 100 young people, just I think out of response to ensure justice, gathered together. And it was really, I think, initially a sort of incredible movement by the people that we hadn't seen since literally 1971. There was in 1991, I think we did have a similar kind of public movement which was demanding the removal of President Ershad then and martial law. So in 1991, there was a sort of collective movement by the people to bring down the martial law dictator who'd kind of legitimized himself through supposed democratic elections. But essentially, he was also trying to sort of bank on the whole kind of using Islam and kind of as sort of a vanguard for his position in enshrining sort of Islam as the sort of state religion, even in a secular country then. So in 1991, we did, I think, have a chance for a real kind of democracy and secular nation. And we tried that sort of 1991 for the next 4 successive governments. We had fairly free and fair elections. But what happened in Shahbag in 2013 was, as I said, I really feel a very sort of spontaneous movement, which was started by young people and just gained momentum. And within a few days, hundreds of thousands of people gathered at this junction demanding justice. But it wasn't well thought out, and it was later politicized. But the initial death list or people that were on the death list were actually people who had talked about bringing justice and taking action against the war criminals. And I literally I personally believe in these, saw overnight how it was politically used very, I think very cleverly to make this whole issue not an issue for justice, but an issue for the non-believer-believer argument, that this movement was actually an atheist, non-believer movement against a sort of Muslim majority nation of believers. And those in Bangladesh, we have deep faith, but I sincerely, deeply believe that we are a very plural and richly cultural nation. And so, and secularism, I think, has been sort of viewed not so far as sort of state, the sort of machinery of the state separating from personal lives, but more a sort of recognition and celebration of different religions being able to practice side by side. And I remember sort of hearing about the early 70s, just after the war, where sort of public broadcast would have not only recitations of the Quran, but the Tripitaka and Hindu recitations and Buddhist recitations, and so it was a Bible, and so that was how I think we viewed our sort of secularism, by celebrating years of our syncretism and pluralism. So I think that it was kind of used very politically then, and what the government did for the next 3 years was I think feared a very, very minority section, and wanting to get certain policies done, they kind of condoned this sort of killing of the bloggers by sort of saying, yes, of course it's wrong to murder bloggers and murder atheists, but at the same time, they shouldn't have hurt religious feelings. So it was condemning, and I think that gave them a sort of, that gave the blogger, those killers a sort of a kind of permission or impunity to sort of carry on. But what happened since the Holi attack was, I think, it was an enormous wake-up call for us all in Bangladesh, and it was something that was kind of, which I think there were several incidents in 2015 that led up to this. The first time ever that foreigners were targeted. I mean, I think for the first 45 years of Bangladesh, probably less than 5 foreigners had been murdered, and that too from probably non-Bangladeshis. So to suddenly have foreigners targeted, writers, publishers targeted in Bangladesh is kind of unprecedented. Because I think that, freedom of the press, although throughout, the last 45 years of 46 years has been subject to various pressures, I think overall in South Asia, there's been extraordinary freedom to, basically sort of express oneself in a enormity of different ways, even when we had martial law in Bangladesh. So I think that the change that happened in 2013, then in 2015, culminated in this, horrific attack at Holi. And as I said, it was a wake-up call to us all. And since then, the government has taken extremely stringent measures. And some of it has kind of backfired in having an overall sense of sort of fear and curbing of freedom of expression. But on the other hand, since 2016 July, we haven't had any serious attacks. We haven't, we've had a lot of reports of how insurgents and religious right-wing extremists have been tracked down and incarcerated. But the flip side of that, obviously, also is the fact that there have been an increase in enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and so it's kind of this balance between sort of the responsibility that the government has to take in sort of dealing with this extremist threat, which is very real, balanced with the freedoms that we want to enjoy as Bangladeshis. And I think the sort of tapestry of where we're at is really visible. I run the Dhaka Literary Festival, and when we started it in 2011, it was. It was with the idea that, Bangladesh was cut off from the rest of the world. We have this amazing, history and culture that nobody else knows about. We wanted to showcase this, and we wanted to bring the greatest thinkers and writers in the world to Bangladesh to sort of inspire our youth. And over the years, it's changed to a place which really matters. I mean, literary spaces really matter. It seemed to us as organizers a matter of life or death that we really needed to keep this literary space. And after Holi in 2016, many people felt that, of course, you're going to cancel it this year. There's no way you're going to be able to hold the festival this year. And we went ahead despite, the obvious concerns. And it was so important and reaffirming. And we did work with the government. They were our partners. And, contrary to some of the sort of articles that came out then, the government clearly we had a sort of deal with the government that we were going to have full editorial control. And so the government didn't censor any of our programming. But we did work with the government to ensure a high level of security for our guests and all the attendees. And that particular year, which was 2016, we had over 20,000 people coming and attending the festival. We didn't tell a single author to censor anything they said. We broached on many topics which we had skirted around before, because for us it was like, no more can we not talk about religion. We cannot be silent about the draconian ICT law amendment, which basically sort of curbs freedom of expression and puts people in it's a non-bailable offense if you tarnish the image of the nation or if you hurt religious sentiment. So at that particular session, we had we had the session in Bangla where everybody sort of I think there was a spontaneous call for basically repealing that act. So there's a certain pushback that we're trying to do, but at the same time, we are seeing a greater level of self-censorship from writers, from commentators, both kind of trying to sort of be careful because you don't want what you write to sort of be the next soundbite that is kind of pounced upon by, sort of extremist trolls on Facebook. On the other hand, you don't want to be put in jail where some sort of over-enthusiastic party hack decides to sort of curb favor with the government and basically, put you in jail. So I think, this is the kind of tapestry that we are kind of working against. I think that there is optimism because I think there is pushback on various sides, and I think literature, culture, an exchange like these, where you're kind of not necessarily on Facebook, where you're kind of you're sort of listening to your own echo chamber, but where you're hopefully talking to a huge range of people and exchanging ideas. And what we've seen, I think, in Bangladesh is more structural changes, where any party that's in power feels that they want more power to sort of, be able to have their own authority established, but then that is then used by the next party to an even greater extent. But I think there's a whole range, or there's a whole scope here for literature, for poetry, for theatre, to sort of challenge this in all sorts of different kind of layers and nuances, and that's my hope.
Thank you, Sadaf, for that fascinating journey, taking us to the course that freedom of expression has been taking in Bangladesh, the initial ambivalence of the government, and being forced to act finally because of international repercussions. I now move on to T.M. Krishna, who in his own field of music has not shied away from speaking out his mind and offending traditionalists, and has come out in support of writers and artists under attack. would you share your thoughts on the space for dissent within the area of culture and also political dissent?
Thank you, Ravi. Before going into the idea of dissent as being something like a battle between the state and society, I'd just like to see how we as members of society view dissent. Because I think it's very easy to get into this very dichotomous kind of an argument when we need to think about what is dissent to us as a cultural idea. And I think there may be problems there itself, and maybe we need to think about that. If you think of dissent, the imageries that seem to come to, generalizations are always dangerous, but dissent seems to have a negative connotation in its construction itself. The moment somebody says dissent, they think of disruption, they think of insensitivity, they think of some kind of an obstruction, some kind of hurting of somebody. This is something that is somehow ingrained in our psyche. Therefore we choose. So who decides what is dissent? Who decides, which power structure decides what is dissent? So before we speak about the government, I think there are social structures that are already seeded these thoughts in our brains. Whether it is patriarchy, whether it is caste in India, whether it is religious bigotry, all these things are the fundamental bodies that have structured the problem of dissent in our head, which the government or the state apes, copies, uses conveniently. So unless we are willing to actually investigate how, also dissent can be of so many varieties or perceived with so many shades, questioning the government. Was Perumal Murugan's book Dissent? Or was it made to be dissent? Perumal Murugan wrote a fictional story. He didn't say, I'm dissenting. So when did that become dissent? When did that become something that was questioning some idea of tradition or religion or purity or sanctity and all these words that we use? So I think the problem lies there on how we construct something to become dissent or not dissent. And which are the powers that decide these things? And unless we're able to, I think, challenge ourselves of not being choosy in terms of dissent, I think we are also party to it at some level. Because we also box our ideas of dissent and decide which can be accepted as not being dissent and which then is hurtful to us and therefore is dissent. Whether it's liberal or non-liberal does not make the difference at all here. So, while I agree with Chandan about Purandaradasa or Basava, while quoting these voices, we are framing these voices also. We are not taking these voices as being a natural discourse of society, whereas we are saying this was a voice of dissent, or this was not a voice of dissent. We are doing it today, in retrospect, depending on which position we lie in. So I think there is it's a cultural phenomena that needs to be asked. Now, in my own field, whatever I say about musical history or religious history, I never perceive it as dissent. I never perceived it as being something as a protest of any sort. It was a natural course of serious inquiry. Dissent is regeneration. Dissent is a natural course of serious inquiry and questioning. Now, it is society and power structures that decide how to frame it and create violence out of it. And coming to our constitution, I think one of the problems we face in India is we don't see ourselves as a modern country. We always see ourselves as being 3,000, 4,000, 10,000, 20,000, 25,000 years old. And I think there is a problem there. The constitution is the spirit of the 2,000 years. Only the day we realize that the constitution is the spirit of that wonderful, multicultural, multi-religious, plural idea that was there in this land that we don't even need to call India. That spirit is what the Constitution has given us. And that flexibility to the Constitution is given us. So we have never learned the Constitution to be a cultural idea. We take it to be some kind of a rule framing mechanism. That's how we are taught in school, and that's how we see it. So therefore, we are very uncomfortable to see ourselves as modern, see ourselves as people of the Constitution, by the Constitution, with the Constitution, for the Constitution. We just refuse to. And therefore, we fall prey constantly to governments, to religious bigots, to castes, to all these structures that then don't use the Constitution but use those 2,000 years to do whatever they want. Or in the name of the 2,000 years, if I may reframe. Coming to political parties, I think it will be extremely hypocritical to sit on the stage in Tamil Nadu and only speak about the BJP in Delhi. This state has had a major problem with dissent for decades. I wouldn't have the guts to say this on this stage 5 years ago. This is the truth, and it's important that it's stated. That today you will hear editorials and columns and columns and columns about how there is so much mafia in Tamil Nadu. We never saw all this 6 years ago. And those few people who said it were harassed, tortured, and we didn't speak about them. So we are as much part of that system that today we are questioning. So I have to say that Tamil Nadu is definitely a case where dissent has been crushed. Mafiadom has completely been part of a cultural political framework, and we have accepted it very happily. As far as the government of India is concerned, you can ask, has something really changed? Hasn't the government, all political establishments always been insensitive, always attacked any kind of criticism, dissent? Entirely true. In my limited understanding of history, I think from the time of Indira Gandhi, that whole idea changed in this country. But there is something that has drastically changed in the last 4 years, and it's important that we also recognize that. That in the last 4 years, what has happened is the government of India, the BJP, the VHP, the RSS, and all fringe, and I'm sorry, I think they have to be named as far as I'm concerned, have created a culture and have done this overtly and also in subversive ways. Have created a culture where it's okay for you and me to be violent and abusive. That is new. We feel it is okay for us to be violent. We feel it is fine to abuse. So the political establishment, the political parties, the party workers, etc., have overtly said this, hinted at it, and also in their reactions to so many cases where people have been attacked, have also in their silence said it is okay. This is new in this country. This is not just about internet trolling. This is not about Facebook abuse. All of us on this panel here have faced enough and more of that. But this is much more than that. This is about feeling that you can actually go hit a person. It's fine. There are people hitting people and taking videos of them and posting it themselves. Have you ever imagined a time this is possible and they are not arrested? Mind you, they are not arrested. I go hit somebody black and blue, my friend videographs it, posts it, and there are likes to that post. And I'm saying we are all liking it. When we like all those abusive posts on Facebook because we think they agree with our ideology, we are being violent. When are we going to realize that we are being violent? These are problems that we are facing today. So we are party to that whole sense of negativity to dissent. We are party. We are going somewhere here. We just heard about North Korea. I don't want to sound like doomsday prediction. But I think the problem happens is when we change as people. When we think it is fine for the government to be oppressive. We think it's fine for the government to be dictatorial because we need to be controlled. When we start thinking that way, we are heading the direction of North Korea. We are heading a direction where we believe we don't need free minds. We believe that a writer or a speaker or a singer must have in the behind of their head or the thought of saying, I can't say this. The greatest form of fear is the fear that is implanted in one's heart. The fear that is implanted in one's heart such that every human action of that individual is self-monitored and self-restrictive. And this country today is doing that actively. And we are all participating it in the name of believing in something. And I think only the day we start questioning these social structures that we are establishing, re-establishing, rekindling, and allowing governments and powers to exploit, only if that awakening somewhere comes, I think dissent will change to be something natural, something normal, something for which we don't need a panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna, for focusing on the power of social structures to label what is dissent and complicity or tolerance of such labeling. I would now move on to Teesta, who with a background in law and personal experience in taking on the state at different levels, would be able to tell us about the state of laws and political dissent, the tolerance for political dissent and the repression of political dissent at the level of the state, at the level of the national government, and so on.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to look at, say, about 70 years of ourselves as a republic and how we've looked at the issue of questioning, dissent, political expression, and look at it at two levels. One is to say that, of course, the last 3.5, 4 years have been particularly bad. I mean, if Bangladesh talks about how many people have been killed as bloggers, I think we need to talk about 63 people killed in lynchings, which is a matter of complete shame in India, but we don't mention those figures because we want to just wish it away. But I think even before we talk about these 4 years, I think we need to historicize and contextualize it at two levels. One is, has this happened overnight? Has this intolerance and this allowing of a very, very violent kind of crushing of any views just suddenly come about, or has it crept upon us, and have we allowed it to creep upon us? And the second level, I like to deal with it as level of history, because that's a passion, and I believe that whether we look at Bhima Koregaon, whether we look at the Mahat Satyagraha, whether we look at the Dharma Parivartan of Ambedkar, long before we go to the Vachanas of Basavanna, I think we, even in terms of before things got so bad, wanted a very linear explanation of history and were not interested in complexities vis-a-vis history teaching. So the Shramana versus Brahmana tradition, we were not so interested in letting the Shramana tradition get to our young people. And why was that? My city is where I believe is a very good example where we began with this entire experiment. I remember 1988, and a threat issued, very open threat by a rabid outfit, saying that we will not allow the government of Maharashtra to publish the riddles against Hinduism. We will not allow this particular volume of Ambedkar to be sold among his 18 published volumes. This was 1988. And you had this party on the rise. You had this party that led the city to burn 25 years ago, in December 93. And you had the media this time not even mark the 25 years, except a few of us independent portals. Nobody mentioned the post-Babri violence, and no media, no newspaper, television channel went back to those dark days when Bombay burned. So it was a Shiv Sena on the rise, and Shiv Sena issues this threat, and it says we remove this book. Now, why this book, apart from all the 18 volumes of Ambedkar? And the answer came 10 days later, when Dalits actually, if the Shiv Sena Morcha was 10,000 or 20,000, you had 150,000 Dalits coming on the streets 10 days later and say, dare you ban the book. So it was a quiet play that happened, after which the Shiv Sena never dared to raise the issue again. But if you go back to the Delhi Book Fair, which is the most prestigious book fair, possibly that's what Delhi thinks anyway, because of the way it sort of imposes ourselves, the capital culture, that the year after Modi came to power, in February 2015, and I visited the stalls there because some of Dalit writers' books were being released, and we went to the Ambedkar stall. And we found the collected works of Baba Saheb Ambedkar being sold, minus 6 volumes. And which were the 6 volumes missing? The one I mentioned, Annihilation of Caste, State and Minorities, State and Shudra. So you had a very sanitized Ambedkar being sold. The kind of Ambedkar that suits the current dispensation. The Ambedkar that did not question Hinduism as a form of oppression as he saw it. Whether you agree with it or not is a different point of view, but that is how he saw it, that is how he critiqued it, and that is how even now the official volumes by the Maharashtra government are sold. We are watching television headlines for the last 3 days on Padmavat. It suddenly becomes Padmavat, so the film is acceptable. When it was Padmavati, it was not. Completely mythical story, and it hurts everybody's sentiments. But the media today is not historicizing the fact that we saw Aubrey Memmon's O Rama. This happened in the 50s. We saw all of Vijay Tendulkar's plays in my state. Ghashiram Kotwal, we talked about the Peshwai. Shantata Kot Chalu Ahe. All his plays were banned by the same force that then came to power in 1995. We saw in Gujarat, Parzania being banned and not allowed to be shown. We saw Fana being banned simply because Amir Khan dared to go to the Narmada Bachao Andolan rally in Delhi. So we are living in a strange era that some of us silly people need to keep pinprick all these reminders, but most of the media wants to black it out because we are looking at it just as sensations and not looking at it as a process where fascism actually creeps upon you and actually then ends. It's like the story of the frog in the well, you know, the frog is in the well and the temperature is being raised slowly. It's not that you put the frog in boiling water, but the temperature raises slowly and suddenly you realize that it's so hot that you can't be in the well anymore. So it is this tendency that is today upon us. And of course today you have state and society of that kind which believes in violence to crush dissent merging. And like Krishna said, you have today violence being the norm. And social media is a tool of that violence. I mean, how you can call it social media when it's performing such antisocial acts, I don't know, but that's what we call it. So these are the threads that you see. But I think at heart, we also need to examine how these processes built up. 295A, as Mr. Ravi rightly flagged. Is that a problematic section? 153A, 153B, are those sections that we should look at again? Or are those sections not being read properly? Because in the Anglo-Saxon law that we have it is not about blasphemy. It's not a blasphemy law. It is basically against incitement to violence. And when you have a Bal Thackeray using the pages of the Samna to foment violence against the city's Muslims in Bombay in 92-93, and you have a petition before the court challenging that, and then you have the Bombay High Court justifying those writings, saying that they were about anti-national Muslims. And then you have the Supreme Court not entertaining the special leave petition. What makes me wonder is, has even the judiciary failed to really act against insightful violence? I mean, it's a serious question. You had Thackeray saying in June of 93, and I'm deliberately not talking about Modi's Becharji speech in 2002. It's much more recent. But you had Thackeray saying in June of 93, while the petition is pending before the High Court, he said, I piss on the judgments of courts. And you did not, it's not a laughing matter, you did not have any court issue contempt against him. Was it fear? Was it avoidance? Or was it the fact that we have, as jurists and as jurisprudence, failed to make the distinction between what is legitimate dissent and questioning and incitement to violence against a section of our people? Today you have central ministers openly inciting violence against sections of Indians, saying that unless they follow a certain kind of culture, which by the way is not Hindu culture, it's just a section of Brahmanical Hindu culture, this country will become, I mean, if I say, for instance, that to even espouse the dream of a Hindu Rashtra is anti-constitutional, which I try and say at every forum, because our constitution has rebuffed religion-based nationhood. But we have actually today in force at the center and in 19 states an ideological force that does not believe in the Constitution, that believes in the overthrow of the Constitution. And that's the kind of tricky area we are at. I mean, of course, we've not made the Constitution a cultural reality and a cultural ideal, but today you have the very force that is supposed to enforce law and order and the Constitution actually believes in an overthrow of it and probably bringing up a very hegemonical, violent order, exclusivist order. So that's where we are at. And the media is under tremendous pressure. I don't want to just bash the media here. We critique the media all the time, but I have had friends in journalists tell me that the newsroom has become a very ugly place. It's become a place where actually it's very difficult for the independent journalist to function. I'm obviously not talking about publications like Hindu and Frontline, which offer us so much hope, but I'm talking about the wider print and television media. So if you are a relatively independent, upright journalist with integrity, it's very difficult to function because you're being told not to function professionally. Now, how do we react to all of this? I think we need to, as citizens, respond to it very, very creatively. We need to respond to what's happening in the media by actually registering through analysis what we believe we think is going wrong. We can't simply be in parallel criticizing it. We need to even file cases on hate speech and make a distinction between hate speech and dissent. We can't let instances of hate speech grow. Because incitement to violence against sections, I will say it, Muslims, Christians, and Dalits particularly, is actually making them fearful for travel. I mean, today traveling in the train is not easy for many sections of Indians. And yet we don't want to say it. I mean, today I've had many Muslims across the country tell me that we watch what we pack in our dabbas. We don't take our kebabs. Because if we do, and suddenly we open that tiffin, who knows what they think will be in that kebab. So the cow vigilante laws, in fact, give the kind of power that Sadaf was talking about and legitimize Gowda. And some of these things need to be responded to in a mass way. I mean, we have lots of things to say about America. India in the past has looked down on America. Today you have a Trump there and a Modi here. But one thing I really envy American institutions because they've come of age is the resistance there has been far, far more intrepid and far more robust. And I look for a time when from the south to the north, we have 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 demonstrations on the streets. Not just like 12th of September when our dear friend Gauri Lankesh was shot dead, but every time there is a lynching like you had in Rajsamand, or Junaid, or Jharkhand. Each time anybody dares to take law into their hands, we need to come out in numbers and say, this is not the India of our streets. This is not the India that we want. I think we are all being lulled into silence and we're all looking behind our backs as to when we should protest and how we should protest. We are being controlled by a fear that if we speak too often, we would be the next target. And the only way, I believe, and this has been my personal experience, I mean, my friends told me that when you started getting targeted in 2010 and 11, why did you stand up for Binax? Then you can be targeted again. Why are you standing out today for Sai Baba? I believe the only way we can circumvent is by building allies and standing up for each other even while we remain the target. There is no way we can fight this fight alone. There's no way we can fight this fight alone, and there's lots of more I wanted to say, but I think we are running out of time. I'd just like to make an appeal from here, is that we really are on the brink. And if India believes that India can remain stable without being sane, secular, democratic, and a republic, I think we are living a fool's paradise. We are really on the brink of a big disaster if we do not convince that every Indian that he or she has a place here, that equality and non-discrimination is the basis of citizenship, and not religion and not privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, Teesta, for focusing on the fact that this is not an entirely new tendency, but a worrisome accentuation of a tendency already in the works, and on focusing on the failure of the judiciary and the need for people to act. We have now time for questions.
My name is Innamburan.
Oh,
I
yes,
have
sir.
a question to Krishna. Unlike these young ladies, you are safely ensconced. Your descent or tangent is ensconced in Madras tradition. Today's
Pardon, could you please repeat?
Today, Krishna's tangent, I use the word tangent, is safely ensconced in Madras tradition. We are quite secure. My question is, today's descent becomes tomorrow's tradition. That is how we have got the Dravidian core fundamentalist religious atheism. That is how you have got RSS, which was a dissent, as becoming the today's ideologue. This greatly disturbs me for India's future. Do you have a solution for this?
I have to first say I completely disagree with your framework. Your choice has been very convenient and also reflects your own perception of what you believe society should be like. So I'm going to just raise two issues. Now, today's dissent becomes tomorrow's tradition is not necessarily a norm. Today's dissent is also wiped out because it is not convenient. You kill people for it. So people are dying because they are dissenting. So let's not trivialize it and say today's dissent becomes tomorrow's tradition. I'm sorry, I take a bit offense because we have lost Gauri Lankesh not too long ago. We've lost many people. We have lost journalists. Today journalists are being attacked if they question Aadhaar. Now instead of saying Aadhaar is a problem, the journalist who investigated Aadhaar is being actually targeted. Now, so we have to be a little careful. You may have multiple problems with the Dravidian movement, but I think a lot of good has happened to this state because of the Dravidian movement, and it's important to state that. Now, are there extreme forces are there some problems in the Dravidian movement? Of course there are problems. There are as many problems also in the Gandhian movements. There are problems in the Marxist movements. There are problems in Vaishnavism. There's problem in Buddhism. There's problem in every isms. The moment something becomes an ism, it's a problem. But that is not the issue here. The issue is, when does this become violent? That's the issue. If today's dissent is good, if today's questioning is going to lead to violence for today, tomorrow, day after, and the day after that, that violence is the problem. The problem is not processes of thinking. The problem is how are we looking at these processes of thinking. I'm very secure. I don't know what Madras tradition means. I'm quite confused by that. I completely agree. One of the reasons I'm secure is because I am also a man. Let's be also very honest about that. But I'll just tell you something that happened yesterday. It happened yesterday to me in Tirupur. I went for a concert yesterday. At 1 p.m., we got a call saying that the concert may be disrupted because some parts of the Hindu Munnani took offense to my post on the Vairamuthu Andal controversy. They have every right to protest. But the plan was that the hall owner was told that the concert cannot happen. Do we normalize that? Are we going to say we're going to normalize that? And say, fine, you can go and disrupt anything? Is that what we are looking at? Dissent is a discourse, sir. That we have to remember.
Thank you.
I'm Aditya here. I just wanted to play a little bit more with what Teesta said. That is when this actual normalization of violence is accepted. But I just wanted to play, because we were only talking about the period of modern India of 70 years, which is what Teesta elaborated on. I wanted to ask, now, since there were deep fissures as our country was partitioned, the Indian subcontinent, and that was due to a Gandhian ideology or not, I'm not going to go into that. But unfortunately, would you say that the muted politics after partition, which reinforced those hidden fissures, if I may call them, they continued on and on for the decades to come until we reached this breaking point of the last 4 years, when you had a renewed majoritarianism in, so to say, a response to the minoritarianism, whether socially or economically, that were reinforced by the political diaspora before this majoritarianism started. So weren't these fissures always there? And they were always being reinforced by the economic, for instance, favoring the minorities, whether it is with SOPs or with something like that, which had this kind of a knee-jerk reaction in today's society. I just wanted to know how you would have a take on that, you and TMK for that.
The Sachar Committee report very clearly shows that there was no really SOPs ever granted to any minority, religious minority in this country. But I would like to say one thing for sure is that in a sense it's the reverse. I feel that a couple of things happened in the mid-80s. One is that you saw the renewal of a very sharp majoritarian movement in the name of building a Ram temple, which is going on still. And that movement was not really for building a temple, it was actually to really abuse, target Indian Muslims, Babar ki aulad, warp history, and to actually legitimize a certain hate discourse. But what you also saw, which I think maybe you're referring to indirectly, is that unfortunately there was not much democratization in the way that the mainstream political parties dealt with minorities themselves. There was only a negotiation with the religious clergy and often the male religious clergy. So this gave a perception, and I'm deliberately mentioning the mid-80s again, where you talk about, on the one hand, you have the talas of the Babri mosque opening, and you also had the ridiculous response of the Rajiv Gandhi government to the Shah Bano case. So I remember Bombay at that time, and you had these huge meetings taking place across the length and breadth of Bombay. All men, all Muslim men, not Muslim women at all, where you're saying you dare interfere with our personal law. Now that language very clearly played into a certain fear among the middle section of the minority that, this is again a Muslim asking for a separate treatment. They had earlier asked for a separate state. So I think the problem was this negotiation with the Muslim male clergy and not negotiating with, down the line, the women of the community were always asking for better rights. You've had Muslim women struggling for better rights. You've had Muslim progressive liberals asking for better rights. But the larger political parties, and I'm sorry, even there, the left did not make much headway in terms of negotiating with a democratic setup. So this kind of created legitimization of I think the fissures that you mentioned. And let's not forget one more dimension. I think the aggressive push of India into the neoliberal economic era, which started in the early 1990s, has so atomized us that even the collectivization of our concerns and collectivization of our struggles and thing has become very, very difficult. So I would put it like that.
Thank you all panelists for your wonderful presentations and bringing your thoughts and clarity to the issues.